He was stolen from his home before he turned 11, branded, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic. He should have died nameless like millions of others, but instead, he learned to read. He learned to write, and with ink and memory, Olaudah Equiano turned pain into testimony. His book would travel farther than any ship he ever served on, and long after his body broke, his words would break the chains of millions. Olaudah Equiano was born in Sensted among the Igbo people, in what is now Nigeria, a world alive with rhythm, belief, and belonging. His village was filled with the sound of drums echoing through red earth, with women pounding yam, and children chasing one another beneath a sky that glowed like brass at dusk. It was a world where every name carried a meaning, every scar marked a story, and every ritual bound the living to the ancestors. Equiano's earliest memories were not of fear, but of music, laughter, and fields heavy with harvest. His family was respected in the community. His father was an elder, his mother known for her kindness. From them, the boy learned discipline and faith, how to speak to spirits, and how to give thanks to the sun for every dawn. The Igbo world was small, but it was complete. It had its gods, its order, its sense of right and wrong. That sense would never leave him. But one afternoon, when the air was heavy and still, raiders came. The smell of smoke replaced that of yam and wood fire. Men with weapons stormed the village, shouting in languages the children did not know. Equiano and his sister were seized and dragged away before their cries reached their parents. From that moment, his life became a chain of hands, each one selling him to another, each one pushing him farther from home. He and his sister clung to each other during those first nights, whispering stories they could barely remember. Then, they were separated. He was sold again and again, from village to village, each transaction cutting another thread that tied him to who he had been. Eventually, the road turned to sand, the air filled with the smell of salt and decay. Ahead lay something beyond his imagination, a shore crowded with ships, cages, and white-faced men shouting orders. Equiano had never seen the ocean before. It looked endless, terrifying, and alive. When he was forced aboard the ship, he felt the world tilt beneath him. The cries of strangers echoed in the darkness, and the boy who had once run free among yam fields entered the belly of something that devoured both light and memory. That was the day the child of the sun was swallowed by the sea, and the day Olaudah Equiano's first life ended. The slave ship Etna was no vessel of adventure. It was a tomb made of timber, designed not for travel, but for profit. Equiano was pushed below deck, where hundreds of men, women, and children lay shackled, shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with human waste, sweat, and fear. There was no room to move, no air to breathe, and no mercy to find. He wrote later that the stench was so overpowering that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. Some captives died before the ship even left the coast. Others prayed for death. Those who could not bear the horror threw themselves overboard, seeking the deep as an escape from chains. Above deck, sailors barked orders, laughing and cursing. When storms came, the ship rolled violently, and the captives below screamed as chains tore into flesh. The crew answered with whips. To them, this suffering was not cruelty, it was routine. Every lash was a lesson, every death a calculation. For the boy from the land of sun, the voyage was a descent into something beyond hell. He watched grown men weep like children. He saw mothers beg to feed their infants, only to be struck for speaking. The moans and prayers in dozens of languages became a single sound, the sound of despair. At times, he was brought on deck to wash or to dance, not for joy, but to keep the cargo healthy. The sailors laughed as they forced the captives to move to the rhythm of drums. Equiano's body obeyed, but his mind drifted somewhere else, to the smell of yam fields, to his sister's voice, to the idea that this nightmare could not last forever. The ship crossed the Atlantic in weeks, but for him, time had stopped. He had become something less than human in the eyes of those who owned him, and yet something more than a victim within himself. Because even in that suffocating dark, he began to observe, to remember, to think. Every scream etched itself into his soul like scripture. Every death became a question. By the time the ship reached Barbados, The child had already begun his transformation from a boy sold into silence to a man who would one day give voice to the voiceless. Barbados was the end of the line for many. For Equiano, it was only the beginning of a new kind of captivity, one wrapped in commerce, cruelty, and the illusion of civility. On the docks, he was lined up with other captives, their skin glistening under the sun, as buyers inspected them like horses. Fingers pried open mouths to check teeth, hands pressed muscles, pinched skin, and prodded scars. Men in powdered wigs debated prices as if haggling over barrels of rum. He was a child, stripped naked before strangers, his body trembling not from cold, but from shame. His language Igbo was now useless. Every word he spoke fell into emptiness. Then came the sound that would erase his past entirely. A name, foreign and heavy, Gustavus Vasa. That was the name his new owner, a British naval officer named Michael Pascal, gave him. It was a cruel ritual of possession, repeated across continents, the renaming of souls. From that day, Olaudah Equiano, son of the Igbo, ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. But inside him, something refused to die. Pascal took him aboard a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Roebuck. The boy who had once feared the ocean now belonged to it. He learned quickly how to tie knots, clean decks, navigate ropes, and read the moods of the sea. The sailors mocked him, sometimes beat him, yet a few took pity and taught him words. Rope, wind, sail, map. Every term became a small victory, a tool in a growing arsenal of understanding. He began to notice everything: the officers' manners, the hierarchy of command, the rhythms of discipline. The ship, cruel as it was, also became his school. At night, while the others slept, he gazed toward the horizon. The waves whispered in languages. He was starting to learn languages of distance, of endurance. When Pascal's ship sailed into war during the 7 years conflict, Equiano saw the world explode in fire. Cannon smoke, mixed with salt wind. Men screamed as the sea swallowed ships whole. He saw courage and horror woven together, and he began to ask himself which was worse, dying in battle or living in bondage. Though Pascal treated him better than most, Equiano understood the truth. Kindness from a master was not freedom. It was only a softer chain. Still, he learned, he observed, and he waited. The boy once sold like a tool was slowly turning himself into a man who would use tools of his own words, thought, and memory. They could rename him, but they could not unlearn him. The sea gave Equiano knowledge, but it was the word that gave him purpose. During long voyages on the Roebuck, he met sailors who read the Bible aloud. At first, the strange book puzzled him: stories of freedom, of chosen people escaping slavery, of a God who parted seas. He listened with growing fascination. For someone who had seen hell beneath a ship's deck, the idea of deliverance was no longer abstract. It was a promise. He persuaded one of the ship's crew to teach him to read. Letters and words became keys, and he turned each page like a man unlocking a door. When he finally deciphered sentences on his own, he felt the world open in silence. The Bible was not merely religion to him, it was proof that understanding could outlive suffering. As war raged across oceans, Equiano served alongside the crew, facing storms and gunfire. He risked his life in service, believing loyalty might earn him liberty. But the truth of empire was cruel. Even bravery could be sold. When peace came, Pascal betrayed him. Without warning or farewell, he sold Equiano once again, this time to a merchant bound for the Caribbean. It was as if his years of service had never existed. Thrown into a new cycle of bondage, Equiano felt the familiar sting of chains, the suffocating weight of despair. But something had changed within him. He was no longer a helpless boy. He had words now and faith. He carried scraps of paper hidden in his clothes, tracing letters by candlelight when no one watched. He copied verses from the Bible, not for worship, but for survival. Each word was a small act of rebellion. On the docks of the Caribbean, he saw other men beaten, women humiliated, children crying, the same scenes he had lived as a child. But he also saw commerce: barrels of sugar, crates of rum, the relentless hum of an empire, powered by human misery. He began to understand that slavery was not chaos, it was order. carefully built to profit from suffering. Yet, amid that order, he saw a crack. Greed was predictable, and knowledge could slip through it. Equiano held on to that thought like a compass. If power came from knowledge, then freedom must come from truth. He vowed that one day he would not only escape, he would speak, not with cries, but with words strong enough to outlive the whip. By the time Equiano reached Montserrat, the Caribbean sun had become a cruel companion, brilliant but merciless, shining over endless fields of sugar and sweat. There, he was sold again, this time to a merchant named Robert King. Compared to other masters, King was pragmatic rather than sadistic. He saw in Equiano not just labor, but profit. The young man was clever, disciplined, and fluent in trade. King made him work on his ships, loading and selling goods across the islands. Equiano was no longer chained in the hold, yet he knew he was still a possession. The freedom to move, to breathe, to earn all of it belonged to someone else. Still, he found an opening in that small degree of trust. King paid him a wage, a pittance, but real money. Equiano began saving every coin, every shilling from side work, trading fruits, small goods, and whatever scraps he could. The years that followed were a slow, grinding resurrection. He was whipped less, insulted less, but the humiliation lingered in every boy that strangers called him. His body carried scars from shackles, but his mind carried maps not of geography, but of the system itself. He had begun to understand how it worked, how one man's cruelty fed another's profit, how the empire turned flesh into gold. He wrote later that saving 40 pounds, the price of his own body, took years of exhaustion and restraint. He faced thieves, dishonest sailors, and temptations to give up. But one morning, the moment came. He stood before King and presented the money. The papers were drawn up, stamped, signed. His freedom was purchased not by kindness or luck, but by relentless will. Equiano would call that day a resurrection. Yet it was a resurrection with no paradise waiting. On the streets of Bridgetown, white sailors still spat at him. He carried his manumission papers everywhere, folded neatly in a pouch, proof that he was free, though the world refused to see it. Freedom, he realized, was not a place. It was a state of vigilance. It could be revoked, denied, erased by a single lie. So he guarded it with truth. That truth would soon take form not in the language of rebellion, but in the quiet persistence of ink. Freedom had come, but it was lonely. Equiano had no land, no family, and no flag to claim him. In a world divided between masters and slaves, he belonged nowhere. So he chose the only homeland left, the sea. For years, he worked as a seaman, traveling from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. The ship was both exile and refuge. The world unfolded before him: icy winds off Greenland, golden sunsets over Malta, the iron scent of cannon smoke off Gibraltar. Each voyage expanded his mind and deepened his sorrow. He saw the empire from all sides, now its glory built upon rot. In European ports, he walked among men who preached Christianity and civilization, yet traded flesh as if it were salt. He saw bishops bless ships that carried human cargo. He saw sailors pray for mercy, then chain others without hesitation. Every contradiction carved deeper questions into him. How could men read the same Bible and find justification for such cruelty? Equiano began keeping notes: prices of captives, conditions of voyages, the words and actions of men who called themselves civilized. He wrote not as a scholar, but as a witness. His memories became records. His pain became evidence. He was learning how history was made, not by kings, but by those who wrote it. In Sense, Divac, he joined an expedition to the Arctic, one of the first black men to set foot in those frozen waters. The white of the ice reflected nothing of race or hierarchy. For a moment, he felt equal before the cold. He wrote later that it was the first time he had seen a place untainted by slavery, where even the sea refused to carry chains. When he returned to England, he found himself drawn to the growing movement against the slave trade. There, he met Quakers, reformers, and other free black men, the sons of Africa, who shared his conviction that words could destroy what whips had built. He began to speak publicly, his calm tone contrasting the horrors he described. The audience listened, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with disbelief, but he did not need their sympathy, only their attention. And so, Olaudah Equiano, once a nameless boy from the land of the sun, now a man without a country, began to build his own nation, one made not of borders, but of truth. Every speech, every page, every letter he wrote was another act of defiance against oblivion. He was no longer property of an empire. He was becoming the property of history. Insensibek bat tushu. Olaudah Equiano took the final risk of his life, not with a sword or a ship, but with a pen. After years of notes, memories, and letters, he published the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African. It was not a plea. It was not even revenge. It was testimony, a mirror held up to an empire that refused to look at itself. The book began quietly. A child stolen from his home, a ship filled with screams, a world that profited from pain. But page by page, it grew into something larger, an anatomy of the slave trade, written by one who had survived it. He described the smell of the hold, the taste of hunger, the sound of chains grinding through sleep. He wrote not to shock, but to make readers feel the weight of every name erased, every family broken. And it worked. The book spread faster than the empire itself. Within months, it was being read in parlors, parliament, and pulpits. Aristocrats discussed it over tea. Clergymen quoted it in sermons. Abolitionists carried it as a weapon of words. Even those who defended the trade could not dismiss it because this was not rumor or propaganda. It was evidence, signed in flesh and memory. Equiano became a public figure. He was invited to lecture in towns and cities across Britain, from Bristol to Edinburgh. Crowds gathered to see the man who had lived the unthinkable and written it with grace. His calm presence was disarming. He did not shout, he reasoned. He did not accuse, he revealed. And in revealing, he condemned the entire moral architecture of empire. His narrative was more than autobiography. It was revolution in ink. He showed that a black man could not only endure, but also write, argue, and publish acts that defied the very foundation of white supremacy. But fame brought danger. The book's success exposed him to envy and attack. Planters accused him of lies. Traders called him ungrateful. Some readers refused to believe that an African could produce such refined English. Others whispered that he had never been enslaved at all. Equiano met it all with composure. The truth, he wrote, needs no master. And indeed, his words outlasted every insult. The year the interesting narrative appeared, Britain's abolitionist campaign reached new strength. Petitions flooded Parliament. Debates grew louder. For the first time, the moral center of the empire began to tremble. In candlelit rooms, ordinary men and women began to wonder, if what this African wrote is true, how can we remain human and still do nothing? Equiano had turned his life into a mirror, and the world could no longer look away. If the book was his sword, the years that followed were his war. Critics and politicians tried to silence him. Pamphlets appeared, claiming he was an imposter, that he had been born in South Carolina, not Africa. The attack was not against facts, but against the idea that an African voice could carry truth. But Equiano refused to yield. He continued lecturing, traveling from town to town, with his worn-out copies of the book, his papers, and his quiet conviction. He did not argue for revenge. He argued for reason. In a century obsessed with civilization, he forced civilization to confront its savagery. He allied himself with reformers like Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson, and with the Sons of Africa, a group of free black men in London who fought for the end of the slave trade. Together, they published letters, speeches, and petitions demanding Parliament act. Their words became a chorus of resistance. Equiano's tone was not fiery. It was relentless. He described in exact detail the torture of captives, the economic hypocrisy of merchants, and the moral decay of nations that profited from sin. He had lived it, and his calm precision was more devastating than anger. He wrote that slavery did not just destroy bodies, it corrupted the souls of those who tolerated it. His audiences could no longer deny what they read in his eyes. This was not theory. This was history written in flesh. The more his enemies mocked, the more people listened. Women organized abolitionist circles. Children recited his story in schools. The image of the chained African kneeling beneath the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" became the emblem of the movement. By the sense de Piacu Jumbio, Equiano's voice had helped transform a private grief into public outrage. His book was reprinted 9 times in his lifetime. His testimony had crossed the Atlantic again, not in chains, but in pages. Still, the struggle took its toll. He was often exhausted, sick, and disillusioned by the slowness of change. Parliament debated, but delayed. The merchants of Liverpool and Bristol defended their profits with blood-soaked logic. Yet, even as his body weakened, his pen did not. He continued to write letters and give speeches until his voice broke with fatigue. He knew the victory might not come in his lifetime, but he also knew something far greater, that once the truth had been spoken, it could never again be enslaved. The boy who had once been silenced on a ship now wielded silence as power, letting his words echo long after the applause had faded. By the late sense de Piacu Nubio, Equiano was no longer just an author, he had become a living symbol. His book had passed through parlors and pulpits, stirring guilt, admiration, and unease. But while his words crossed oceans, his body was failing. Years of travel, poor health, and exhaustion had worn him down. He had married Susanna Cullen, an Englishwoman, in Sench de Picu Juni. For a time, life seemed almost gentle. They had 2 daughters, Anna Maria and Joanna. In the rare calm between campaigns, he found a kind of domestic peace he had never known, reading to his children by candlelight, speaking softly of a homeland they would never see. But even that light dimmed too soon. Susanna died in Sensti Dufkaugerleft, and their eldest daughter followed shortly after. Grief hollowed him. The man who had survived storms and chains was undone by silence. He withdrew from public life, spending his last months quietly in London, writing letters and revising his book for reprints. Friends visited, describing him as calm, reflective, and strangely at peace. He knew that the world was beginning to turn. In Parliament, the abolitionist cause was gathering force. His allies, Sharp, Clarkson, and Wilberforce, were still fighting. Equiano had done his part. In March Sensti DK Camas, at just 52, Olaudah Equiano died. There was no grand funeral, no national mourning. The newspapers noted his death briefly. His grave, like the graves of so many he had spoken for, was unmarked, but his book lived. It continued to be printed, quoted, and read by those who would carry the torch after him. Within 10 years, in Sempachokstead, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, ending the legal trade in human beings across the empire. Equiano did not live to see that victory, but his fingerprints were on every line of it. He had written himself into history not as a martyr, but as a memory that could not be erased. Even in death, his presence lingered not in statues or sermons, but in the quiet act of reading. Every page of his narrative was a resurrection of those who had perished without names, their voices gathered into his. The man who had begun life as stolen property ended it as something far rarer, a free soul whose truth outlived empires. More than 2 centuries later, Olaudah Equiano's voice has never gone silent. His interesting narrative remains one of the first best-selling books written by an African author, a foundation stone of both abolitionist thought and modern human rights literature. In classrooms, his words are studied not just as history, but as warning. He reminds readers that freedom is not a gift, but a construction built painfully, one act of truth at a time. Modern historians trace much of Britain's abolitionist awakening to his testimony. Yet, beyond politics and law, his story carries something more intimate, the rediscovery of humanity itself. When he wrote of mothers screaming for their children, he forced readers to hear not statistics but suffering. When he described learning to read, he showed that literacy was not mere education, but resurrection. Equiano turned the tools of his oppressors, their language, their religion, their print into weapons against them. His pen dismantled centuries of lies brick by brick. Through him, words became a form of rebellion that no empire could fully suppress. Today, his legacy continues to echo across continents. Statues of abolitionists stand in squares, His name is carved into plaques. Yet, the truest memorial to him remains invisible every time a child learns to read. Every time a truth is written against injustice. Every time a story refuses to die. Equiano's life teaches that survival is not enough. Memory must be transformed into meaning. Pain must become a map for those still lost in systems of cruelty. He had once written, "I hope to see the same freedom for my brethren that I have obtained for myself." That hope did not end with him. It lives wherever people read his words aloud and feel the pulse beneath them, not just of one man, but of millions he spoke for. The boy from Igbo land who was dragged in chains became the man who chained tyranny with ink, and though his bones are dust, his sentences still breathe across oceans, across generations, reminding the world that the truest freedom is not given by kings or parliaments, but written, again and again, by those who refuse to forget.